A millionaire accustomed to being in control decides to explore the streets of a disadvantaged neighborhood. Upon finding an abandoned puppy, he finds himself caught up in a series of unexpected events. The help of a local veterinarian brings him face to face with forces threatening the neighborhood. The sun was setting over the skyscrapers of New York City when Richard Montgomery, one of the richest and most mysterious men in the country, decided to do something completely out of his routine. For the first time in years, he dismissed his private driver and decided to walk through the streets of Hope Gardens, a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The 45-year-old businessman, known for his coldness in business and rarely appearing in public, wore an impeccable Italian suit that completely clashed with his surroundings. As he walked distractedly, thinking about the recent events in his life, especially the recent failure of his third marriage, an almost imperceptible sound caught his attention. Between piles of garbage bags near a broken sidewalk, something was moving. Richard hesitated. His first instinct was to ignore it and move on, as he always did with anything that didn't concern his million-dollar business. But that day, something was different. Perhaps it was the loneliness that had consumed him since Julia, his ex-wife, had left him, accusing him of being incapable of loving anything other than his own money. Or maybe it was just curiosity. He approached slowly and among the debris found a dirty, trembling puppy. "Mr. Montgomery, Mr. Montgomery!" An energetic female voice cut through the air, startling Richard. It was Mary Sanders, a young veterinarian who ran a small community clinic in the neighborhood. She recognized him immediately from the rare times his photo appeared in the newspapers. "You shouldn't be here alone, this neighborhood." Richard cut her off with an abrupt gesture, more interested in the small animal that was now whimpering softly. Mary approached, her brown eyes showing a mixture of concern and curiosity at seeing the powerful businessman crouched near the garbage. "He needs urgent help," Mary declared, already bending down to examine the puppy. Her curly hair fell over her face as she did a quick assessment of the animal. "My clinic is nearby, I can—" "That won't be necessary," Richard cut in dryly, standing up and adjusting his suit. "I'll call my driver and take the animal to the best veterinary clinic in the city." Mary stood up too, crossing her arms in defiance. "With all due respect, Mr. Montgomery, but he needs immediate attention. He won't survive a trip across town." The businessman narrowed his eyes, unaccustomed to being contradicted. But there was something about this young woman's determination that intrigued him. Before he could respond, a group of residents began to form around them, curious about the famous millionaire's presence in their neighborhood. Among the observers was Anthony Mendez, a local businessman who controlled much of the area's commerce. His eyes flashed as he recognized Richard Montgomery, his old business rival. Anthony immediately took out his cell phone and began making calls, a malicious smile forming on his lips. Richard, noticing the unwanted attention, finally gave in. "All right, miss, what's your name again?" "Mary." "Mary Sanders," she replied, already gently picking up the puppy in her arms. "Very well, Miss Sanders. Show me your clinic." As they walked through the narrow streets of Hope Gardens, Richard had no idea that this simple walk would completely change the course of his life. Fate had intertwined their paths with Mary's and the small animals in a way that neither of them could have predicted. Anthony Mendez watched them from afar, furiously typing on his cell phone. Richard Montgomery's presence in his territory was a threat he couldn't ignore. His plans for the neighborhood couldn't be compromised by a millionaire playing do-gooder, much less by an idealistic veterinarian who was already causing enough problems with her community clinic. The small veterinary clinic was the opposite of everything Richard Montgomery was used to. The peeling walls, outdated equipment, and lazily spinning ceiling fan made his $10,000 Italian suit seem even more out of place. The smell of cheap disinfectant mixed with pet food infiltrated his nostrils, while his imported shoes creaked on the worn ceramic floor. Mary crossed the crowded waiting room with the puppy in her arms, ignoring the curious looks from the other clients. "This way, Mr. Montgomery," she indicated, her voice firm and professional. Richard followed her, observing how she greeted each person by name, exchanging smiles and words of comfort, with a naturalness he could never imitate. "Mrs. Wilson, I'll see your kitty soon. Mr. Johnson, Buddy's medicine arrives tomorrow, don't worry." Mary distributed attention without losing her rhythm until they reached the examination room. The room was small but impeccably clean, with educational posters on the walls and an examination table in the center. "I need you to wait outside," she said, already preparing the material to examine the puppy. Richard frowned, not used to receiving orders. "I prefer to stay and supervise the care," he replied dryly. Mary stopped what she was doing and faced him. "Mr. Montgomery, with all due respect, here you're not a CEO, you're just the person responsible for this little one, and he needs space and calm to be examined." Outside the clinic, Anthony Mendez observed the movement with interest. At his side, Carlos, his assistant, took notes on a tablet. "Montgomery was always a playboy pretending to be a good guy," Anthony muttered. "But showing up right here in my territory, that's no coincidence." "Want me to do something, boss?" Carlos asked, eager to please. "Not yet. First, I want to know exactly what he's up to." Anthony adjusted the gold watch on his wrist, a nervous habit he had when he started plotting something. "That veterinarian has been a thorn in my side for too long, refusing my offers to buy the clinic. Now this..." Inside the waiting room, Richard found himself surrounded by a reality he never imagined he'd know. An elderly lady held a thin cat wrapped in an old towel, counting change to pay for the consultation. A boy hugged his dog with an improvised leash made of rope, his eyes shining with concern. "Is Dr. Richard going to help Dr. Mary's clinic?" the boy suddenly asked, his voice full of hope. "My mom said he's very rich and could fix everything here." Richard felt the weight of all eyes on him. These people were looking at him as if he were some kind of savior, a role he never wanted to play. Before he could answer, Mary came out of the examination room. "He's very dehydrated and malnourished," she announced, wiping her hands on a towel. "He'll need to stay hospitalized for a few days, but with proper care he'll recover." "Great," Richard responded, already pulling out his checkbook. "How much do you need?" Mary shook her head. "It's not a matter of money, Mr. Montgomery. Our structure is limited. We need equipment we don't have, specific medications." "Then make a list," he interrupted her. "I'll buy everything necessary." A buzz of excitement ran through the waiting room. Mary, however, maintained her serious expression. "Things aren't that simple. We can't just..." At that moment, Anthony Mendez entered the clinic, his beige suit contrasting with the simple environment. "Montgomery, what a surprise to find you in our humble community." His voice was laden with false cordiality. The atmosphere immediately became tense. The residents knew Anthony well and his manipulative way of doing business. Mary stepped forward, instinctively placing herself between the two businessmen. "Mendez," Richard responded coldly, recognizing his old rival. "I didn't know this was your territory." Anthony's smile widened, revealing perfectly white teeth. "Oh, yes. And I'm very interested to know what brings a man of your caliber here." Mary observed the exchange of words with growing concern. She knew Anthony Mendez's tactics all too well, and how he usually dealt with anything that threatened his interests in the neighborhood. Richard Montgomery's presence had just transformed her small clinic into the center of a much larger dispute than she could have imagined. Richard Montgomery woke up startled in his luxurious penthouse, the first rays of sun infiltrating through the floor-to-ceiling windows. For the first time in years, he couldn't sleep thinking about the events of the previous day. The image of the trembling puppy and Mary Sanders' challenging gaze wouldn't leave his mind. His breakfast was interrupted by a call from his press officer. "Mr. Montgomery, you need to see this." On his tablet screen, a flashy headline blinked: "Millionaire Richard Montgomery, hero or opportunist? Surprise visit to community veterinary clinic raises suspicions about his true intentions." The article, signed by a local blog, insinuated that his appearance in Hope Gardens was nothing more than a marketing strategy to clean up his image after past financial scandals. Some anonymous sources, which Richard suspected had been planted by Anthony Mendez, questioned why a man who never cared about social causes would suddenly be interested in a veterinary clinic in the suburbs. Irritated, Richard grabbed his keys and decided to return to the clinic. When he arrived, he found Mary in the midst of a heated discussion with suppliers. "What do you mean you cancelled our medication delivery?" she questioned, her hands trembling with frustration. "The order was confirmed a week ago." The suppliers exchanged nervous glances before one of them answered, "Higher orders, doctor. We can no longer make deliveries to this region." Mary noticed Richard's presence and quickly wiped away a stubborn tear. "Mr. Montgomery, I didn't expect to see you so soon." "How's the puppy?" he asked, trying to maintain his usual neutral expression. "Come see for yourself," she replied, guiding him to a small hospitalization area. The puppy was lying on an improvised bed, still weak, but his eyes already showed more life. Seeing Richard, he wagged his tail slightly. "He recognized you," Mary smiled, surprised. "They always know who really cares." Richard felt something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time. Before he could respond, a commotion in the reception caught his attention. Anthony Mendez had arrived, accompanied by two men in suits. "Dr. Sanders," Anthony announced with false cordiality, "we've come to conduct a surprise inspection. We've received complaints about the sanitary conditions of the establishment." Mary turned pale. "What complaints? We've never had a single complaint." "These are just standard procedures," one of the men replied, pulling out an official document. "If we find irregularities, the clinic will have to be closed immediately." Richard observed the scene with growing interest. He knew this type of tactic well. He had used it himself many times in his business, but seeing it being used against Mary and her patients awakened something different in him. "Mendez," Richard called, his voice cutting through the tense air of the room. "Can we talk in private?" The two businessmen moved away, leaving Mary worried with the inspectors. In the small back office, Richard closed the door. "How much do you want?" he asked directly. Anthony smiled, adjusting his expensive tie. "Montgomery, you've been isolated in your ivory tower for so long that you've forgotten how things work in the real world. It's not about money, it's about territory, influence. Explain yourself. This community has potential for great developments. Doctor, Sanders's clinic occupies a strategic point, but she refuses to sell, and now you show up just when we're about to convince her." Outside the office, Mary tried to stay calm as the inspectors searched every corner of the clinic. Her patients watched apprehensively, some hugging their animals tightly. Little Johnny, the boy with the improvised leash, tugged on her lab coat. "Doctor, Mary, are they going to close the clinic?" His eyes were watery. Before she could answer, the office door opened abruptly. Richard came out first, his normally impassive face now showing fierce determination. Anthony followed him, his cordial expression replaced by a mask of barely contained anger. "Gentlemen," Richard addressed the inspectors, "the inspection is over. You'll receive a full report of the renovations and adjustments that will be made to this clinic in the coming days." Mary stared at him, confused. "Renovations?" "Yes, Dr. Sanders. If you'll allow me, I'd like to make a proposal. Not to buy your clinic," he quickly added, seeing her worried expression, "but to transform it into the largest community veterinary center in the region." Anthony Mendez's face contorted in fury, but he maintained the forced smile. "This isn't over, Montgomery," he muttered before leaving, his henchmen in tow. In the silence that followed, the rescued puppy started barking happily for the first time, as if approving the decision. Richard Montgomery, the man known for his coldness in business, allowed himself a small smile. Maybe Julia was wrong. Maybe he was still capable of caring about something beyond money. The following days brought significant changes to the routine of the veterinary clinic. Architects and engineers transited through the place, taking measurements and elaborating projects, while Mary tried to keep the care running normally. Richard Montgomery appeared daily, always at the end of the afternoon, with the excuse of checking the progress of the renovations and visiting the puppy, who was recovering rapidly. "He needs a name," Mary commented on one of these visits, observing how the businessman crouched, still in his suit, to pet the puppy who already greeted him with joy. "We can't keep calling him Puppy forever." Richard seemed thoughtful, adjusting the expensive tie that the small animal was trying to reach with its paws. "How about Chance?" "Chance?" Mary smiled, surprised by the choice. "Why?" "Because he gave me a second chance to see the world differently," Richard replied, not realizing he was opening up more than he intended. He quickly tried to disguise it. "Besides, it was by chance that we found him." Mary noticed the change in his posture and decided not to push. Instead, she showed him the budgets for the new equipment. "Mr. Montgomery, these values are absolutely necessary," he interrupted her, "and I've asked you to call me Richard." Across the street, hidden in his imported car with tinted windows, Anthony Mendez observed the scene with growing irritation. At his side, Carlos typed furiously on his tablet. "The suppliers confirmed they'll continue refusing deliveries to the clinic," Carlos informed. "But Montgomery is using his own distribution channels." Anthony punched the steering wheel, furious. That arrogant thinks he can come here and change everything. We need to be more creative. How's our plan B? In progress, boss. We've already gained access to the clinic's old documents and found some irregularities that might be useful. Inside the clinic, Mary was organizing a meeting with her employees to discuss the changes that were coming. The team was excited about the prospects for improvement, but also apprehensive about so many transformations. Dr. Mary, Rose, the oldest receptionist, called her attention. The neighborhood folks are talking. They say that after the renovation, prices will go up and we won't be able to serve everyone anymore. Mary felt a tightness in her chest. This was exactly what she had feared from the beginning. Before she could respond, Richard, who was listening to the conversation, spoke up. The prices will remain affordable, he assured, his voice firm. In fact, I intend to create a free care program for special cases. Everyone stared at him, surprised. Was this the same Richard Montgomery known for his greed in business? Mary realized she wasn't the only one going through transformations. The meeting was interrupted by a commotion at the reception. Julia, Richard's ex-wife, had just entered the clinic, her high heels hitting hard against the worn floor. "So this is where you've been hiding, Richard?" she asked, her expensive perfume filling the environment. "At first I thought it was just another one of your publicity stunts, but now I see it's worse. You've really gone mad." Richard remained calm, although Mary could notice how his shoulders tensed. "What do you want, Julia?" "I came to warn you. The board is concerned about your erratic behavior. First you abandon important meetings, now you're spending fortunes on a suburban veterinary clinic. They're considering an extraordinary meeting to discuss your position as CEO." The silence that followed was heavy. Mary felt guilty. She hadn't imagined that her renovations could cause so many problems for Richard. But before she could say anything, Chance appeared, limping slightly, going straight to Richard and nestling at his feet. Julia observed the scene with disdain. "A mutt? Seriously, Richard? You used to have more class. And you used to have more heart," he replied dryly. "People change, Julia, sometimes for the better." Mary noticed the furious look Julia gave her before leaving. It was a look that clearly said this wasn't over. That night, after everyone had gone, Mary stayed late organizing medical records. Chance was sleeping peacefully in his new bed when a strange noise caught her attention. When she checked the source of the sound, her heart froze. Someone had broken the back window of the clinic. In his luxurious office, Richard received an anonymous call. "If you really care about the vet and that mutt, you better rethink your investments in Hope Gardens." The war for Anthony Mendez's territory was just beginning, and now it involved much more than a simple veterinary clinic. It was a battle between the old and the new, between greed and compassion, between who Richard Montgomery used to be and who he was becoming. Mary stared at the shards of glass scattered on the clinic floor, her hands trembling as she dialed Richard's number. It was almost midnight, and Chance was barking insistently at her side, as if trying to alert her to some imminent danger. "Someone broke into the clinic," she said as soon as he answered. The response was immediate. "Don't touch anything, I'm on my way." In less than 20 minutes, Richard arrived accompanied by a private security team. For the first time since she had met him, Mary saw him dressed casually, wearing jeans and a polo shirt, a vision that made him strangely more human. "Are you okay?" was the first thing he asked, his eyes scanning the place for signs of violence. Chance ran to him, jumping and barking excitedly despite the tense situation. "I am," Mary replied, crossing her arms to hide her nervousness. "But this wasn't a simple robbery attempt, Richard. Nothing was taken, it was a warning." The businessman nodded grimly. "I received one too." He showed the anonymous message on his cell phone, and Mary felt a shiver run down her spine. "What does Anthony Mendez really want with this neighborhood?" she asked, her voice betraying her concern. Richard hesitated before answering. He knew more than he was telling, and this seemed to be the moment to reveal some truths. "Hope Gardens is about to receive a major urban revitalization project," he explained, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of restlessness. "Mendez has been buying strategic properties for months, probably for real estate speculation. Your clinic is exactly at the center of the most valuable area." Mary sat down, stunned by the revelation. "That's why the pressure to sell. But why did you decide to help me? What's your real interest in all this?" Before Richard could answer, Rose, the receptionist, burst through the front door, breathless. "Dr. Mary! Dr. Richard!" You need to see this. She extended her cell phone, showing a post that was going viral on social media. It was a series of old clinic documents, some clearly manipulated, suggesting serious irregularities in animal care. The comments were merciless, with people swearing never to bring their pets to the place again. "This is absurd," Mary exclaimed, her hands trembling with anger. "These documents are fake." Richard took the phone, analyzing the images carefully. His years of experience in corporate wars had taught him to recognize a coordinated attack when he saw one. "Mendez is playing hard," he muttered, but he made a mistake. He underestimated who he's dealing with. At this moment, Chance started barking again, this time at the window. Across the street, a familiar figure was observing the movement. Julia, Richard's ex-wife, was talking to none other than Anthony Mendez inside a luxurious car. "So that's it," Richard said, his face hardening. "Julia is involved. The company board, the threat, it's all part of a bigger plan." Mary observed the scene, feeling increasingly involved in a plot that went far beyond her small clinic. "Why would your ex-wife be helping Mendez?" "Because she's still one of the largest shareholders in Montgomery Enterprises," Richard revealed, his voice laden with bitterness. "And if she manages to remove me from the presidency, she'll have enough power to approve any project Mendez proposes." Outside, Julia smiled satisfactorily as Anthony Mendez showed her some documents on his tablet. The plan was underway. Soon Hope Gardens would be theirs, and Richard Montgomery would learn the hard way not to interfere in other people's business. Back at the clinic, Mary began gathering the shards of glass from the floor, her hands still trembling slightly. Richard bent down to help her, their fingers touching briefly over a particularly sharp shard. "You don't have to continue with this," she said softly. "I've already caused you enough trouble." Richard stopped what he was doing and looked at her directly. "Mary, for the first time in years, I'm doing something that really matters. I'm not giving up now." Chance approached the two, carrying his leash in his mouth, as if understanding that this was an important moment. The animal's simple gesture brought a smile to both their lips. "Then let's fight," Mary decided, standing up with new determination. "But we need to be smarter than them." Richard nodded, already formulating a plan in his mind. He had resources and connections that Mendez and Julia couldn't even imagine. The question was, would he be willing to use all his power to protect a veterinary clinic and its dedicated owner? Looking at Mary and Chance, the answer was clear. Some battles are worth fighting, not for money or power, but for something much more valuable, the chance to make a difference in the lives of those who really matter. The morning began bustling at the veterinary clinic. Mary arrived early, determined not to let the threats of the previous night affect the care of the animals. The broken window had already been replaced, courtesy of the maintenance team sent by Richard. "Dr. Mary!" Rose ran into her office, her face pale. "Chance is gone." "What do you mean gone?" Mary felt her heart race. "He was in the recovery kennel." A quick inspection revealed that the kennel door had been opened during the night, despite the new security system installed. On the bed where Chance used to sleep, there was only a piece of paper with a typed message. "Some sacrifices are necessary for progress." Richard arrived at the clinic in record time after receiving Mary's call. His normally controlled face revealed a mixture of concern and fury that scared even his security guards. "The security cameras," he demanded immediately. "We need to see the footage." But when they tried to access the system, they discovered that all the recordings from the night had been erased. Whoever had taken Chance knew exactly what they were doing. "This is professional work," Richard muttered, examining the equipment. "Mendez is escalating the game." Mary paced back and forth, her hands trembling. "It's not just a game, Richard. Chance is still recovering. He needs special care." Before she could finish, her cell phone rang. It was a message from an unknown number with an attached video. In the images, Chance appeared frightened, confined in a small cage in a dark place. "My God," Mary whispered, tears streaming down her face. Richard watched the video several times, analyzing every detail of the environment. His years of experience in tough negotiations had taught him to keep calm even in the most tense situations. But this time it was different. For the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless. "I'm going to call the police," Mary decided, but Richard stopped her. "No. Mendez has connections in the local police. We need to solve this another way." At this moment, Julia entered the clinic, her high heels echoing on the floor. Her smile was as cold as a winter morning. "What a coincidence to find you here so early," she commented, feigning surprise. "Did something happen?" Richard stared at her fixedly. "Where's Chance, Julia?" "Chance? Oh, the mutt!" She laughed, a joyless sound. "Why would I know anything about him? Maybe he ran away. Or maybe it's a sign that you should focus your energies on more important things." Mary stepped forward, her voice trembling with contained anger. "Important, like helping Mendez destroy the neighborhood?" Julia seemed genuinely surprised by the direct confrontation. For a moment, her mask of superiority faltered. "You don't understand anything, darling," she replied, regaining her composure. "There are bigger things at stake here. Richard is throwing away years of hard work because of a ridiculous sentimentality." "No," Richard interrupted, his voice loaded with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. "For the first time, I'm seeing things clearly. And you, Julia, have just made a serious mistake." He took out his cell phone and made a quick call. "Sandra, call an extraordinary board meeting for this afternoon. I have some interesting revelations about certain parallel negotiations of one of our shareholders." Julia's face paled. "You wouldn't dare." "I would. And you know I have enough evidence to question much more than just your latest transactions." The confrontation was interrupted by a new message on Mary's cell phone. This time, it was a photo of Chance, along with geographic coordinates and a warning. "You have 2 hours. Come alone or the dog suffers the consequences." Richard tried to stop her from going, but Mary was already decided. "I can't risk his life." "Then don't go alone," he insisted, holding her hands. "Let me help." Julia observed the scene with an enigmatic expression. Something in the interaction between her ex-husband and the veterinarian bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "Don't you realize you're being manipulated?" she tried one last time. "All this because of a street dog?" "No," Mary replied firmly. "It's because of something much bigger. It's about doing the right thing even when it's difficult. Something you seem to have forgotten a long time ago, Julia." The words hit Julia like a slap. For a moment, everyone could see a flash of doubt in her eyes, as if something of her old humanity still existed beneath the cold surface. The coordinates led Mary to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Hope Gardens. The place, surrounded by walls covered with faded graffiti, seemed to have been an old factory. Richard had insisted on following her discreetly, keeping his distance in his armored car, while his security team strategically positioned themselves around the perimeter. "I'm going in," Mary whispered into the small communicator Richard had convinced her to use. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it echoing in her ears. The interior of the warehouse was plunged into twilight, with beams of light penetrating through holes in the rusty roof. The sound of her footsteps reverberated in the empty space, mixing with the distant barking of a dog. "Chance?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. "Where are you, little one?" "What a moving scene," Anthony Mendez's voice echoed through the warehouse. He emerged from the shadows, impeccably dressed as always. The dedicated veterinarian risking everything for a mutt. "Where's Chance?" Mary demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. Mendez smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The dog is fine, for now, but it's not about him that we need to talk, is it?" At this moment, to Mary's surprise, Julia also came out of the shadows. Her face showed a troubled expression, very different from her usual mask of superiority. "Julia, what are you—" "She's here because she finally understood where her true interests lie," Mendez interrupted. "Isn't that right, dear?" Julia didn't respond immediately. Her eyes wandered around the warehouse, avoiding direct contact with Mary. "Dr. Sanders," Mendez continued, his voice assuming a businesslike tone, "I'll be direct. I have here a contract to sell your clinic. The amount is more than generous. Sign it and we all win. The dog returns safe and sound, and you can open a much bigger clinic somewhere else." Mary felt a wave of indignation growing in her chest. "And abandon my patients? The families who depend on the clinic? Never." "Don't be foolish," Mendez growled, his educated facade beginning to crack. "Do you really think you can stop progress? Hope Gardens will change with or without your cooperation." "Progress?" Mary laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call expelling families from their homes? Destroying an entire community?" A sharp bark cut through the air, followed by whimpers of pain. Mary's heart tightened as she recognized Chance's voice. "Last chance," Mendez warned. "Sign the contract." "Don't do it, Mary. Richard's voice echoed through the warehouse. He emerged from a side entrance, followed by 2 security guards. His face was tense, but his eyes shone with determination. "Montgomery," Mendez sighed theatrically, "always trying to play the hero. But this time you've chosen the wrong side." "The only wrong side here is yours, Mendez," Richard replied, slowly approaching. "And I have proof." He took a flash drive from his pocket. "All your deals, the bribes, the threats. It's all here, including your plan to remove me from the presidency using Julia." Julia visibly paled. "Anthony, you assured me that—" "Quiet," Mendez shouted, completely losing his composure. "No one will believe your forged evidence, Montgomery." "The board will," Richard smiled. "Especially because Julia will confirm everything, won't she?" All eyes turned to Julia, who seemed to be waging an internal battle. Her eyes met Mary's, and something seemed to change in her expression. "Enough," she muttered, before raising her voice. "Enough, I can't be part of this anymore." Julia walked to a dark corner of the warehouse and returned carrying Chance, who looked scared but unharmed. The puppy immediately began to struggle, wanting to go to Mary. "You traitor!" Mendez advanced toward Julia, but Richard's security guards were faster, restraining him. Mary ran to get Chance, tears of relief streaming down her face as the puppy frantically licked her hands. Richard approached, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "It's over, Mendez," he declared. "Your evidence has already been sent to the proper authorities, and this time your contacts in the police won't be able to help." Julia approached Mary, her face showing genuine remorse. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I lost myself somewhere along the way. Seeing you two the way you care, it made me remember who I used to be." The days following the confrontation at the warehouse were intense. The news of Anthony Mendez's scheme spread quickly through the media, triggering a wave of investigations that revealed a web of corruption much larger than anyone had imagined. Julia, fulfilling her promise, collaborated with the authorities, providing crucial documents that proved the illicit activities. At the veterinary clinic, life began to resume its normal rhythm, albeit in a different way. Chance recovered completely, becoming the official mascot of the place. His story of overcoming had become a symbol of hope for the entire community. "He's grown so much," Mary commented one afternoon, watching the puppy play in the new recreation area that had been built behind the clinic. Richard was by her side, his impeccable suit contrasting with the enthusiastic licks Chance was distributing on his hands. "So is this place," he replied, looking around. The clinic was unrecognizable after the renovation. Modern equipment, spacious and airy rooms, a larger and better trained team. But most importantly, it maintained its welcoming essence. "Dr. Richard, Dr. Mary." Johnny, the boy with the improvised leash, came running towards them. Look what Buddy learned. The dog, now wearing a new collar, sat obediently at his command. Richard smiled, a gesture that now became more frequent on his face. "Impressive, Johnny. You have a way with animals." The boy puffed out his chest with pride. "Dr. Mary said that if I study hard, I can be a veterinarian someday." "And you can," Mary confirmed, affectionately messing up the boy's hair. "In fact, Richard, I think it's time we talked about that idea of yours." Richard nodded, his face assuming a more serious expression. "The professional training center project?" "Exactly. Many young people in the neighborhood, like Johnny, have potential but lack opportunities." At this moment, Julia entered the courtyard, carrying a folder of documents. Her presence still caused some discomfort, but she was genuinely committed to redeeming herself. "I brought the contracts for the scholarship program," she announced, avoiding looking directly at Richard. Since deciding to collaborate with the investigations, Julia had dedicated herself to social projects, mainly focused on education. "Great," Mary replied, taking the papers. "With this, we can start the selection process for the first students." The conversation was interrupted by Rose, who came running, agitated. "Dr. Mary, Dr. Richard, you need to see this." She turned on the TV in the room, tuning to a news channel. A special report about Hope Gardens was on air, showing the transformation of the neighborhood in recent months. The camera focused on the veterinary clinic, now a modern and welcoming complex, and on the stories of residents who had been impacted by the project. "Hope Gardens has become a model of social transformation," narrated the reporter, "an example of how the partnership between private initiative and community can generate real and lasting changes." The report showed images of Chance playing with the neighborhood children, of Johnny studying to become a veterinarian, of residents actively participating in social projects. "It's amazing," Mary whispered, moved. "It all started with an abandoned puppy." "No," Richard replied, finally finding the courage to say what was in his heart. "It started with you, your compassion, your determination. You taught me to see the world in a different way." Mary felt her heart race even more when Richard approached, his eyes revealing a vulnerability she had never seen before. "You know why I never moved closer, even with all the work we have here?" he asked softly. Mary shook her head, unable to form words. "Because every morning, making this journey here, knowing I'm going to see you, has become the best part of my day." Chance barked happily, as if approving the confession, breaking the tension of the moment. Mary couldn't contain a laugh, while tears of happiness shone in her eyes. "You took a while to realize that, didn't you?" she gently teased. "Sometimes the biggest businessmen are the slowest to see what's right in front of them," he replied, a genuine smile lighting up his face. Outside the room, Julia discreetly observed the scene, a satisfied smile on her lips. Maybe some stories really needed to end for others, more beautiful ones to begin. The day of the inauguration of the professional training center dawned sunny, as if the sky itself wanted to celebrate. The street in front of the clinic was decorated with banners and balloons, and a crowd had already gathered since early morning. The new building, connected to the veterinary clinic by a covered walkway, impressed with its modern yet welcoming architecture. Mary observed everything from the window of her office, her heart overflowing with emotion. Last night's conversation with Richard still echoed in her mind, making her stomach flutter every time she thought about it. "Nervous?" Julia's voice surprised her. Richard's ex-wife had become a constant presence, and surprisingly, a friend. "A little," Mary admitted, adjusting for the 10th time the dress she had chosen, especially for the occasion. "You're not nervous about the inauguration," Julia commented with a knowing smile. "It's because of him, isn't it?" Mary blushed, but before she could respond, Johnny burst through the door, proudly wearing the new uniform of the center's students. "Dr. Mary, you need to see. There are a lot of reporters out there, and Chance is a big hit with everyone." Indeed, the dog had become a local celebrity. His story of overcoming, intertwined with the transformation of the neighborhood, had captured everyone's heart. At that moment, he was patiently posing for photos, wearing a bow tie that matched the solemn moment. "Mary," Richard's voice made her turn. He was standing at the door, more elegant than ever in his new suit. But there was something different in his eyes, a glimmer of anxiety she had never seen before. "Can we talk for a minute, in private?" Julia smiled, leading Johnny out of the room. "Come on, little one. I think the adults need a moment." When they were alone, Richard seemed strangely nervous, something rare for a man known for his self-confidence. "Before the ceremony starts, I need to tell you something," he began, his voice softer than normal. "Actually, I need to show you something." He led her to the walkway connecting the two buildings. From up there, they could see the entire extent of Hope Gardens. The neighborhood was different, renovated streets, painted facades, well-tended gardens. But it wasn't just the physical appearance that had changed. There was a new energy in the air, a sense of hope and possibilities. "Look there," Richard pointed to a plot of land a few blocks away. "That will be the site of the next project. A cultural center with a library, theater, and space for art workshops." Mary looked at him surprised. "Another project? But I thought after the training center—" "Mary," he gently interrupted her, taking her hands in his. "This is just the beginning. I realized that all the money and power I accumulated over the years meant nothing until I found a real purpose. And that purpose, well, it started with an abandoned dog, but it turned into something much bigger when I met you." Tears began to form in Mary's eyes as Richard continued. "You taught me that success isn't measured by numbers in a bank account, but by the impact we have on people's lives. And now," he hesitated, revealing a vulnerability that few had ever witnessed, "now I want to continue building this legacy by your side, not just as project partners, but—" A joyful bark interrupted them. Chance had escaped from his admirers and climbed up to the walkway carrying something in his mouth, a small blue velvet box. Mary brought her hands to her mouth, surprised, as Richard took the box, a nervous smile on his lips. "He's been rehearsing this for days," Richard confessed, kneeling down. I think he was as anxious as I was for this moment. Outside, the crowd began to notice what was happening on the walkway. Julia, who was watching everything from below, couldn't contain an emotional smile. Johnny jumped with excitement, while Rose tried unsuccessfully to hold back tears. Mary Sanders, Richard began, his voice trembling slightly, you taught me to love again. Not just a person or an animal, but life itself. You showed me that it's possible to be successful without losing your humanity. That power and compassion can walk hand in hand. And now, in front of all these people you helped transform, I ask you... Chance barked again, as if wanting to hurry the moment, drawing emotional laughs from all present. Will you marry me? Richard's words echoed across the walkway, making Mary's heart race. Chance, still sitting next to him, wagged his tail anxiously, as if understanding the importance of that moment. Yes, she answered, tears of happiness streaming down her face. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The crowd below erupted in applause and cheers of joy. Johnny jumped with excitement, Rose cried openly, and even Julia couldn't contain her emotion, discreetly wiping away a tear. When Richard placed the ring on her finger, Mary noticed a special detail. The design included small dog paws engraved in the platinum, a tribute to the beginning of their story. The inauguration ceremony that followed was much more than just the opening of a professional training center. It became a celebration of love, hope, and transformation. Richard and Mary, hand in hand, cut the inaugural ribbon together, symbolizing the union that had changed not only their lives, but all of Hope Gardens. Johnny was the first to give his speech as a student representative, his young voice laden with emotion. Before Dr. Mary and Dr. Richard, many people here had given up on dreaming. Today, we not only dream again, but we're making those dreams come true. Julia surprised everyone by taking the stage next. When I was married to Richard, I always thought I knew everything about him, but it took losing him to understand that I didn't know the most important thing, his heart. It took a dedicated veterinarian and an abandoned dog to reveal the extraordinary man he was always capable of being. The afternoon wore on, and the inauguration party turned into a true community celebration. Residents shared stories of how the clinic and new projects had changed their lives. Chance circulated among the guests, receiving affection and spreading joy, as if he knew he was the true Cupid of this story. At the end of the day, when most of the guests had already left, Mary and Richard remained on the walkway, watching the sunset over the neighborhood they had helped transform. You know, Mary commented, leaning back against Richard's chest, when I first saw you all stiff in your expensive suit, I never imagined we'd be here. Richard laughed softly, and when I saw that stubborn veterinarian giving me orders, never thought she would completely change my life. Chance, lying at their feet, let out a sleepy yawn. His bow tie was crooked after a whole day of celebrations. He's our miracle, Mary smiled, observing the dog, our little four-legged angel. Actually, Richard replied, gently kissing her forehead, I think we're his miracle. He knew exactly what he was doing when he decided to be found that night. The future looked promising ahead of them. The training center was just the beginning. Other projects were already in development. The community library, the theater, professional training programs. Hope Gardens was becoming a model of social development for the entire country. But more important than all the projects and achievements was the personal transformation. Richard Montgomery, the cold and calculating businessman, had discovered that true success wasn't measured in bank figures, but in smiles and transformed lives. Mary Sanders, the dedicated veterinarian who never gave up on her principles, had proven that love and compassion are the most powerful forces of transformation. And Chance, the little abandoned dog that united their destinies, continued there, a faithful guardian of a story that proved that the greatest miracles happen when we open our hearts to the unexpected. Ready to go home? Mary asked, noticing that night was beginning to fall. Richard smiled, hugging her tighter. I'm already home. Here with you and Chance is exactly where I should be. The lights of Hope Gardens began to turn on, one by one, illuminating a neighborhood that had rediscovered its soul. And on that walkway, under the starry sky, a businessman, a veterinarian, and a dog celebrated not just a love, but the certainty that sometimes you need to get completely lost to find your true path. Dear listeners, we hope that Mary and Richard's story has touched your hearts. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the transformative power of love. Share your thoughts in the comments. After all, what was the moment that moved you the most in this journey of transformation? See you in the next story.